Okay, let's go. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this this webinar for the OrcaFlex 11.2 user group meetings. This is the new features in OrcaWave webinar, following on from the new features in OrcaFlex session last week. My name is Chris Heaton. I'll be doing the presenting today. I'm in the software development team at Orcina. And also on the webinar with me today are my colleagues from the development team, David Heffernan and James Pell. But I'm going to be doing most of the speaking, I think. For those of you who were at these meetings the last time around, you'll know that they were earlier in 2021, and that was because a bit out of schedule. The release for 11.1 was delayed somewhat, so this is the second set of these meetings in the calendar year. But we're back on our traditional schedule now of releasing 11.2 in the fourth quarter. So here we are with another set of UGMs and webinars for you. It does mean that it's been less than 12 months since the last release. And therefore it's a slightly shorter development cycle than traditional. So there's perhaps a bit less material in this release than normal, but I still think there's plenty to talk about. Hopefully things of use and interest to you. Okay, we're with the webinar format, obviously because of the COVID pandemic. And I think this is the format we're going to stick with in future, actually, because we think it works well for these meetings. So in terms of the Zoom webinar, if you have questions as we're going along, please type them in the Q&A box that you have available to you, and my colleagues will be looking at those as we go along. And I think, well, you may get answers typed directly to you as we go, or you may have your question delayed until the end of the session for live Q&A and discussion. Okay, so I think we're ready to begin proper now. Let me just show you my contents. Those are the features I'm going to talk through as we go through the what's new material. I'll have a little discussion at the end of future developments. And what might be in the next release, and then, as I say, at the very end of the webinar, we'll get into Q&A, and I'll pick up any or discuss any questions that are open from the Q&A that you type as we go along. Okay, so I'm going to depart from PowerPoint now and show you my OrcaWave. So hopefully you can still see that. Am I still sharing my screen? It's not highlighted as I was expecting. Okay, good. So the first thing I want to talk about was mesh file formats. So there's not an awful lot to say about this, but just to make you aware, oh no, I've forgotten. Actually, my very first thing I want to remind you of, which is the what's new item in the help pages. So you can find it in the help menu for OrcaWave, but it's also linked from the help menu in the program. And that is this page. So if you've not seen it before, it's just a reminder, really, in case you haven't seen this before, that this is a sort of very short précis of all the new items in each of the releases. So if you want more information on what I'm saying today, the easiest way to navigate to it is to go to the what's new and start clicking on the links into the more detailed documentation. Yes, I'm glad I didn't quite forget to say that. Okay, so on with item number one, which is mesh file formats. So in OrcaWave, if you're providing mesh data, there's now a new item at the bottom of the list of choices for mesh file formats, and that's the wavefront OBJ file. So if those files are available to you and they're useful, you now have the opportunity to use them directly in OrcaWave. The only other thing to say about these files is that they do quite commonly exist with varying different axis conventions. However, if you're using it in OrcaWave, the program assumes that your OBJ file will use the same conventions as OrcaWave, which is to say a right-handed axis system and the z-axis pointing vertically upwards. So if you have a wavefront OBJ file with a different set of conventions, you'll need to export it afresh from your meshing tool. So that's just a word of warning, really. But otherwise, there's not much else to say. This list has been growing steadily of mesh file formats that we support. If there's another format that is particularly useful to you, then let us know. We're always open to suggestions for adding to that list. It's quite easy to do. Okay, so that was a very quick little item to cover. Let me move on to something a bit more substantive, which is the restarts item in the what's new for OrcaWave. So restarts are really an upgrade of intermediate results, which was something we introduced in OrcaWave 11.1. But they've been upgraded and rebranded as well, if you like, as restarts. But the essence, the core functionality is unchanged, and that is that you can use saved results from a first analysis, which we term the parent model, to accelerate the calculation in a later analysis, which we call the child model. The new workflow and the new naming terminology are all as close as possible to the analogous functionality in OrcaFlex, which is one minor benefit of this. But there are also some new features along the way, which I'll show you. So what I propose to do is give you a quick demonstration of a restart analysis using one of my toy problems. So what I've got here, let me show you the mesh view, is an OrcaWave model for a tension leg platform. And what I'm proposing to do is use restarts to experiment with different models of the mooring system. In practice, this structure is tethered to the seabed with a tether at each corner of the structure, and I want to experiment with different ways of representing those moorings in OrcaWave. But it's quite a large mesh. It's not absolutely huge, but it's got several thousand panels, and it will take 5, maybe 10 minutes to solve a calculation in OrcaWave. So I don't want to have to repeat the full calculation every time. So that's why restarts are applicable here. So I begin with an OrcaWave model that's going to be my parent for later restarts, and that is what this model is, and it's a perfectly standard OrcaWave model. The crucial thing is I've ticked an output option here on the output calculation and output page to include intermediate results. So that's what's going to allow me to perform restart analysis from the results of this model. So that's done, and it's already run, and I've saved the results, so you're not going to have to wait 10 minutes to watch the progress bars ticking away. Now in this model, I'm simply not attempting to model the mooring system at all. I've just ticked to fix the motion of this platform in all degrees of freedom. So in the parent, for argument's sake, I've just not made any attempt to model the mooring system. Now, if I go to create a new OrcaWave model, I can show you how to start a restart analysis. And this is the workflow. So I go File, New Restart Analysis, and I have to nominate a parent model for this restart. Well, that's going to be the model I just showed you in the same folder. And we save this file so that the program knows where the folder is and where the relative paths point to. So now that's it. I have a restart model, and it begins by inheriting all the information, all the data from the parent. So now if I go back to the mesh view, it looks exactly the same. Now I can start making modifications to this restart analysis that differ from the parent model. And I'm going to start experimenting with, as I said, models of the mooring system. So the first one I've got is a very simplistic, idealized model. In practice, there are vertical tethers coming down from my tension leg platform, and a very idealized model of those is that they're very stiff and they resist any kind of vertical motion, any heave or roll or pitch, but they don't significantly resist horizontal motion. So it's a very simplistic model, but it's easy to capture. All I have to do is unfix, make the horizontal degrees of freedom free to move. And I do that in this restart model, and you can see that those changes relative to the parent model are now highlighted in the user interface, and that's what we call change tracking. So that's something that's new, and it's quite a big addition in OrcaWave 11.2. You might have seen it in OrcaFlex if you've been using restarts since 11.1. So changes relative to the parent model are all highlighted in the user interface. You can do things like, if you've changed a value, you can, from the context menu, you can restore it back to the original value of the parent model. So we think this is a very powerful tool. It works well with text data files as well. So if I show you the text representation of this model, which is in this new, also new in 11.2, edit data as text option in the user interface, this is the entire text representation of the model, and this is what would be saved to the text data file. If I were to hit save now, that's the parent model, and then these are the changes relative to the parent model, and OrcaWave will track the changes as you make them or unmake them as you go along. So you can see here, this is also useful because you can see in one place all the changes which might, in the data form, be spread across different tabs and pages. You can also edit the data here as well if you want to and apply those changes, but that's not what I'm planning to do here. So that's change tracking, and you'll see a bit more of that as I'm showing you the demo, and hopefully you'll see how powerful it can be. And I have a restart model, and I can run this, and it doesn't take 10 minutes. It takes very short amount of time to run, and that's because it's a restart model and it's reusing the calculation results for the diffraction problem from the parent model. So it's loading information from the parent model and reusing it appropriately, and it doesn't have to perform the full calculation. And here you can see some displacement RAOs for this very simplistic model of the mooring system. Heave, roll, and pitch motion is all zeros, all 10 to the minus 15, 10 to the minus 18. But the surge, sway, and yaw, the horizontal motion, is now free to move a little bit in response to the wave loading. So that's a very simplistic model of the mooring system, and I'm going to show you a slightly more sophisticated model now of that mooring system, again by doing a restart analysis. So let me go back to the mesh view. As I said, in practice, what I really want to represent are 4 tethers, one from each corner of the platform. Now, in OrcaWave, the way to represent the loading from tethers like that on the body is via the external stiffness matrix, which is here on the constraints data. So that's it in principle. How in practice do you get a 6x6 stiffness matrix for a system of tethers let me go back to the graphs. Let me show you. I've got an OrcaFlex model, and I'm going to use some of the tools in the OrcaFlex toolbox to generate that stiffness matrix. So I have an OrcaFlex model here where I've imported my parent model results from OrcaWave. So I've got this tension leg platform. It's imaginatively called body 1, and I've added a link at each corner, so an elastic tether, and I've specified the length of the tether and the stiffness such that this tension leg platform really is in equilibrium in the position that it's sitting in the water. And now this is the clever bit in OrcaFlex, which I'm going to make use of. We solve statics for this model. Then I can, in the context menu for the body, the platform, I can go report mooring stiffness, and OrcaFlex tells me 6x6 stiffness matrix. So that's magic, really. That's the 6x6 matrix I need to copy and paste into OrcaWave. And if I go back to, I'm just getting Zoom controls in my way here, right? If I go back to OrcaWave, I'm not going to force you to watch me copy and paste that stuff. I've got another restart model where I've entered that data in. So those are the stiffness matrix values that we just saw. And I've unfixed all the degrees of freedom here. And this data item is highlighted as well because it's become relevant, but I'm not actually using a roll damping target in this case, but because I've freed up the roll motion, it's now possible to include roll damping, and that's why that data is highlighted. So again, if you go to edit data as text, you can reassure yourself that these are all the changes that are made to the restart model relative to the parent. It's all this stuff on this page and nothing else. So now I've got a more sophisticated mooring model in OrcaWave, representation of the mooring, and I can solve that. And again, it's a restart model, so it runs much quicker than the full model. And now I have some similar but different displacement RAOs. If I flick back to the previous ones, just to remind you, the horizontal motion is relatively similar, but it's not exactly the same. The heave and the roll and the pitch, the vertical motion is now non-zero, but it's pretty small. And I could continue experimenting in this vein now and try having more tethers or different stiffness properties and so on. And I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that that using the restart analysis in OrcaWave, it makes that kind of experimentation much quicker and much easier, so it can save you quite a lot of time in total. Right, so that is the fundamentals of the restarts workflow. An important detail to mention, which is covered in the documentation and is the same as the intermediate results in 11.1. Important detail to mention is that the child model, there are certain fundamental data items that can't differ between the parent and the child, and that's because we want to reuse the calculation results. So those calculation results have to be relevant. The main things you can't change are the wave, incident wave periods and headings, and the body mesh. There's a lot of data you can change. So I showed you changing stuff in the constraints page. You can change inertia data, Morison elements data, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute, field points for C-state RAOs, QTF data, anything in one of those areas. If you want to be performing repeated experiments, then restarts are potentially a useful tool for you. Okay, so there's one more thing just in this area that I want to show you, and that is there's also in 11.2 a new model type, which is a variation model. The workflow for those is very similar. Create one by going File, New Variation Model, and you choose a parent model. I could choose the same one if I wanted to. And you sort of proceed as before. But the difference is that in a variation model, you're not going to reuse the calculation results from the parent. And there are two consequences of that. One is that the variation model will be calculated in full, so you don't save any time, you don't accelerate the calculation. But on the other hand, the other consequence is that you're free to change any data you want, so you can change the mesh file or anything. There's no requirement to leave any of the data the same in the child and the parent. So variation models are superficially similar, but they serve a different purpose, really. They're to allow you to organize, if you want to do a set of calculations with slightly altered parameters in your model, you can organize that work and keep track of exactly what you've changed and what you haven't in each case. That's really I think the purpose of variation models, in my mind. Restart models, on the other hand, I mean, you get the change tracking as well, but you really, I think the primary driver for those is in OrcaWave is that you can accelerate your calculations if you're changing data and rerunning in the areas that I mentioned. Okay, I've sort of rattled through a quick demonstration there. I feel like I've done it very quickly, but I don't want you to have your morning spent watching me copying and pasting data items. But nevertheless, I hope it's a useful little demonstration of what you can do with restarts. I'll move on to something else now, which is the Morison elements I tantalized you with earlier. So these are completely new in OrcaWave 11.2. We told you they were coming in the last UGMs. So what are they? These are rigid cylinders. That's what the name refers to, which attract hydrodynamic drag forces, and the terminology is taken from the same objects that exist in OrcaFlex. So typically, these are used to model smaller parts of a structure, relatively small parts, as in the example I'm about to show you. Here we go, let's open that DAT file. So this is the OC4 floating wind turbine platform, which I'm sure most of you have heard of before. And this is the example OrcaFlex file, data file that I've taken from the Orkina website. And let me show you it in shaded graphics. So this is an OrcaFlex file that has the platform, has Morison elements, which are the green struts here, and it also has mooring lines in that OrcaFlex model. So this is a structure where there are relatively small struts which aren't part of the diffraction analysis because they don't really feel significant wave loads and they don't interfere with the wave field, but they do attract hydrodynamic drag. So that's the kind of application that these objects get used for. So let me go back to OrcaWave and show you an OrcaWave model, the same situation that now has some of these new objects, these Morison elements in it. So the first question, which I need to answer, is why have we added these objects to OrcaWave? You can already include them in your OrcaFlex analysis. Why do we need them in OrcaWave? And the point here is that the drag on these elements does and can, significantly potentially affect the motion of the structure. And in the world of OrcaWave, the motion is the displacement RAOs, And the displacement RAOs, as it says in the help pages for OrcaWave, they are part of the calculation of QTFs and C-state RAOs. So, the conclusion of that is that if the viscous drag here has a significant effect on the motion, then that effect really must be included in the displacement RAOs in OrcaWave in order to get properly consistent QTFs and C-state RAOs. So that's the motivation for including these drag effects in OrcaWave. It's really so that you can get these consistent QTFs and C-state RAOs. So if I come back to the OrcaWave model now, you might have noticed from the file name when I open it that this is another restart model. I've got a parent model here that doesn't have the Morison elements in, which is essentially the OrcaWave model that's in this L02 example on the website. And I've added the Morison elements, and they're on the obvious page on the data form. So I've got 4 types of elements with different, drag diameters and drag coefficients, and then a number of elements of each type listed in this table. And they're shown in green on the mesh view. So this is another situation clearly where restarts are your friend. If you want to add Morison elements, modify the type, the drag coefficients, and so on, you can do that within the restart, the data that can be changed in a restart analysis. So you can experiment with this data pretty quickly. Anyway, this is a model that has those Morison elements in, and if I run it, it'll solve very quickly because it's a restart, and I get some displacement RAO results there. I'm not going to labour the point, but if I were to show you the results without the Morison elements on the same mesh, there would be some change here in the motion. I think from memory, it's the heave motion particularly that has the most significant effect of this drag. But in this particular problem, it's a relatively small change for this C state. So I mentioned C state, and that's because, as well as the Morison elements themselves, there are a couple of other changes in this restart to the data that's in the parent. Well, let me reset the calculation. The one I want to talk about is this here. So this new data item on the environment page, I've ticked here to use a wave spectrum for drag linearization. And the reason that has been added to the program is that we must linearize the drag on these Morison elements in order to include it in the OrcaWave equation of motion. And that's because the drag is quadratic, and the equation of motion is at first order in wave amplitude in OrcaWave. So the drag must be linearized, and we do the linearization in the same way as OrcaFlex frequency domain. So it's stochastic linearization for a specific C state. So so this is now part of the Morison elements addition to 11.2. You can now specify a C state to get used for the drag linearization, and that's all it's used for. It doesn't get used for anything else in OrcaWave. So if you're familiar with wave trains in OrcaFlex, then I'm sure this is all very familiar data. You choose your wave type, your head, your wave height, period, and then your spectral parameters and so on. And you can view the frequency spectrum and the wave components. So you specify a C state, and then that is used in the drag linearization for the drag on your Morison elements. And again, this is data that you might want to experiment with. You might want to change the C state and you can do so within the confines of a restart analysis. So I could choose a different wave type and run again, and it would be another very quick calculation. Okay, so that's the wave spectrum and the C state. That's new, and I emphasize again, it's only used for drag linearization. Otherwise, the wave environment is the same as in previous versions. And let me show you now one other thing which is, I think, worth pointing out and making you aware of, which is this radio button on the Morison elements page, where you're given a choice over Morison fluid velocity. So what's this all about? Well, the Morison drag formula is quadratic, as I said, and it's quadratic in the relative velocity between the object and the fluid that it's moving through. So this choice here gives you control over what type of fluid velocity is used in that drag formula. You can either use, well, the full wave field is what it sounds like. It's the entire diffracted wave field, so it includes the incident wave and the scattered wave and the radiated waves caused by the motion of the bodies, or the body in the model. The undisturbed incident wave option is a simpler and faster calculation where the fluid velocity in the drag, the Morison drag equation, is just the fluid velocity due to the incident wave. So you have a choice here, and obviously you can change this in your restart model and see what impact it has. One is slightly quicker than the other, although it's not a huge cost in doing the full wave field calculation. Whether the simpler version is appropriate is obviously model and context dependent, but that's worth bringing to your attention, I think. Incidentally, the undisturbed instant wave approach is a match for the approach that's used in the OrcaFlex frequency domain linearization of drag on these objects. So if you're using the simpler option here at the top, you would get drag linearization and an equation of motion that's exactly equivalent to what you could do in the frequency domain in an OrcaFlex model. So if you're someone who uses that, then I think it's good to know about the equivalence of those two things. Okay, good. So that just about covers Morison elements, I think, in principle. Happy to take your questions if you've got them towards the end, if you want to type them into the Q&A. There's only one more thing to say, really, which is that the import into OrcaFlex can now be done to a model that has these Morison elements in OrcaWave, and it will import those into your OrcaFlex model for you. So I could go complete circle here and save the results of this OrcaWave model I'm showing you, import it into OrcaFlex, and get back to something that looks very similar to the OrcaFlex model I showed you at the beginning, which is one of the examples from the website. Okay, good. So I think that just about covers the Morison elements. Yeah, and I'll move on. I'll take a little drink and I'll move on. So let me show you the help. The next thing I want to talk about is decomposed panel results. There's not an awful lot to say about these, but I'll show you the relevant bit of the help. We've added these after requests from a number of users actually. So I'm sure that there is at least a small number of you who are going to use these straight away. These are new results that allow you to get the panel pressure or indeed the panel velocity, but I think panel pressure is the more common thing that people are interested in, decomposed into these contributions here. A contribution from the diffraction part of the wave field and the contributions from each of the radiation components in the wave field. So this is a decomposition which you can piece the bits together, combine them with the displacement REOs, that's the psi quantity in this equation, and the total recovers the total panel pressure, which has been available for some time in OrcaWave. We had a number of users asking for the components to be available separately here, so they're made available to you. And that's all there is to say, really. If you want to know more, there's a bit more information in the help file there, as you can see. Right, let me move on to something fresh, which is body data origins. Let me open another OrcaWave model now. So this is a new data item, which you'll see in OrcaWave, and it's here available on the moment of inertia, next to the moment of inertia matrix. It's also available in a couple of other places as well, and this allows you to say, well, I've provided a matrix here of an inertia tensor, and this box here allows you to say, well, that matrix relates to the following origin. So in previous versions of OrcaWave, you had to provide this matrix relative to the body origin, which is a point defined to be on the free surface, the water plane. And we didn't have many direct requests for this, but we saw in our questions in software support that a lot of users were finding this inconvenient, because typically you have this moment of inertia data, you know it at the center of mass, and then we were forcing you to translate it to another location to provide it to OrcaWave relative to the body origin. So we've added this now, which allows you to instead provide inertia data at the center of mass, or indeed at a location of your choice. So let me open the other model in this folder, which has the same mesh and completely equivalent inertia data, but now specified at the center of mass. So now it's a slightly more familiar looking diagonal tensor, and this we've told OrcaWave that this information is relative to the center of mass rather than the center of the origin of the body coordinate system, the body origin. So that's it. This is just a little bit of data pre-processing, but hopefully it will make life a bit easier and reduces the opportunity for a mistake to happen in the preparation of the data to put into the model. So I hope that will be useful. I've shown it you here on the moment of inertia. The same option is available if you're providing radii of gyration matrix, and it's also available for the external stiffness and the external damping matrices. Good, okay, I think that's all there is to it. It's quite a small development, but hopefully a useful one. I'm going to mention briefly now something else, which is body reporting origins. So I'm not really going to go any deeper into this than the what's new item. It's just to make you aware that you can now, via the API, you can get your RAO results and your added mass and damping results reported at an origin of your choice by OrcaWave, whereas by default these results are all reported relative to the body origin. The reason for this is just to make life easier if you're comparing results from a prior analysis or a prior project where you have some diffraction data that was perhaps calculated in a different program, might have a different set of conventions and a different origin, and it just makes it easier to compare if you're checking that you've got your model consistent with a prior analysis. So there's plenty more information in the help and in the API help for that, but just to make you aware that it exists. Right, and I have one more small little thing to say before I get back to something more substantive. So that is hydrostatic properties. So I've got a model open here. No, I don't. I've closed it. Let me reopen it. I've got a model open here of an FPSO vessel, and new in OrcaWave 11.2, you can see the hydrostatic results for that mesh, for that body, in the mesh details spreadsheet. So this information, this was all available previously, but it was always in the past, you had to perform a calculation to find this information in the results, in the hydrostatic results. We've now made it available before you run a calculation, just to make it easier if there's something you want to check before launching a time-consuming calculation. That hydrostatic stuff is available to you now before you perform a run. Again, that's quite a simple one. There's not an awful lot more to say about that, but it may be useful. Now let me move on to connections, which is the last of my substantive new items to tell you about. Connections in OrcaWave, again, the terminology is borrowed from OrcaFlex. So if you're an OrcaFlex user, you'll understand what the terminology means. It allows you to specify that two bodies in a multi-body model are rigidly connected to one another. So let me show you a simple example of that. I've got an OrcaWave model here of a very simple catamaran, and in reality, the two hulls are rigidly connected, obviously by a structure above the waterline. But in this OrcaWave model, the two hulls are specified as separate bodies. So I need to use this new connections feature to tell OrcaWave that they are supposed to be rigidly connected. So a catamaran is one application, but another application, which is perhaps more complicated again, is the OC4 floating wind platform I showed you earlier. So here's a modified version of that same model I showed you earlier. No Morison elements now, just to keep things simple. But now each of the four floaters is a separate model with its own mesh file in this OrcaWave model. So that's now a more complicated version of the model I showed you earlier. So it begs the question, why am I telling you about a more complicated way of modeling the situation that was already shown earlier with a single body, including all the parts of the structure? Well, this motivation for this really came from requests that we saw from users through our software support questions. It turns out that we found out that some users wanted to take a structure like this, or like the catamaran example, and they wanted to import their results into OrcaFlex and run an OrcaFlex analysis in which these different parts were different vessels, and they wanted to study the dynamic connection loads between the vessels in OrcaFlex. And if you do that and work backwards up the chain, it means that they have to be separate bodies in the OrcaWave model. fine. And then, but again, why do we need the connections in OrcaWave? Well, that's in order to get the displacement RAOs correct in OrcaWave. And that's parallel to the argument I was making earlier with Morison elements, that you need to get the motion, the displacement RAOs correct in OrcaWave if you want to get consistent QTFs and C-state RAOs from your OrcaWave calculation. So that's the motivation. As I say, you do end up with a more complicated OrcaWave model, but it allows you to do some further things down the chain in OrcaFlex. So that's the motivation. Let me show you how it works. So here we have a new data item here on the constraints tab, say connector body. So for each body, and there are 4 bodies in this problem, the central part of the structure and then the 3 peripheral parts. For each of those, I need to specify that they're connected to another one. So this is, excuse me, much like connections in OrcaFlex, you can't have a kind of circular dependence, but you can have a chain of connections. So in this case, for instance, I might say that each of the 3 peripheral bodies are connected to the central floater. Actually, it doesn't matter which way around you specify the connections, or if you have a chain of connections, they would be completely equivalent. And then I could solve this and get the displacement RAOs. So let me show you this in action. So I've already run the version of this platform where the bodies are not connected and they're free to move. So if I import that data into OrcaFlex and run a very simple simulation where the motion is just given by displacement RAOs, hopefully you can see here that those 4 different parts of the wind turbine platform are moving around independently, and that's clearly not what we want. So the load RAOs and the added mass and damping might well be correct here, but you have no hope of getting consistent QTFs if that's what the motion looks like. Let me go back to OrcaWave. No, I'm not sure what I modified and what I didn't, so let's reopen that multi-body model of this platform. And if I specify this connection data again, so that each one is connected to another, check I've not got that wrong. So now I can solve this. It's a relatively coarse mesh. I think there is a coarse mesh and a fine mesh in the examples on our website for this platform. So let me save the results from that calculation, and now I can do the same thing again. Now, hopefully, I've modified my my results file. I can import again, do a very simple OrcaFlex analysis with the motion given by the displacement RAOs. And now you can see that the bits of the platform really are moving as if they're rigidly connected to one another. So now you could hope to develop some QTF results or some C-state RAO results in OrcaWave for this model, and get some trustworthy results. Okay, so that is connections. There is a health warning to mention with them, which is that each of the bodies that's connected must be a standard valid body for an OrcaWave analysis. So there must be a closed surface surrounded by water, as in this case, or as in the two hulls on the catamaran. What you can't do with this feature is take one of these floaters and split it into two parts, each of which is sort of open-ended or open-sided, and then say to OrcaWave, oh, well, they're connected, and expect that to work. That's a more complicated problem, which this version of the software can't handle. Now, we have had a couple of requests for that even more complicated situation. We think it's possible, but it would require further development. So if that's something that you're interested in, and you haven't told us already, then please tell us so we can gauge how much interest there is in that. But at the moment, you can't do that with this feature. It has to be standard closed closed surface bodies, as in the two examples I've shown you with this and the catamaran. Okay, good. So I think that's connections. There is a what's new item relating to, let me just reset that, this new data item here, which we've added, sort of motivated by connections, but I'll refer you to the help if you're interested in it. My short summary of it is that actually I think in practical situations the standard method will suffice, and the analytic method is really only of academic interest as far as I know. But we've added it because it's helpful for some of our test scripts, and it might be helpful for you, but I'm not sure that I see yet a situation where it would be of practical significance. But if you're interested, you can see the what's new item and the documentation on that. And then there's only one more thing to mention before I wrap up here, which is the new comments field, which we've added on this tab, this model tab, which actually itself is new. So you can start typing your comments in here, and this is just a plain text box. This information isn't used by OrcaWave in the calculation at all, but it's somewhere for you to perhaps keep useful notes or records of what you did, what you were trying to do when you set up the model. It's purely a convenience feature. Okay, so I think that just about covers everything in the what's new list for 11.2. I've rattled through some of that more quickly than I expected, and some of that a bit more slowly. But anyway, I think that's covered everything. I'll finish the presentation now by going back to, that's the wrong window, back to the PowerPoint slides. And just talk about future developments for a couple of minutes. So this slide is just a health warning, really. I'm about to show you a list of potential future developments. Please give us your feedback in the feedback forms after the webinar, or after that. You can just send us an email to the usual address, orkina@orkina.com. And if you have requests, then please let us know about them, and if possible, try and give us background information, because that really does help us to understand exactly what you're asking for, and it helps us to prioritize as well. And it probably, if we're honest, adds weight to your request if you can give us a bit of information about what you're trying to do and what you need to be able to do it. As I've talked today, I've gone through some relatively large and relatively small developments. We always try and do a mixture of both, so you don't have to restrict your requests to large items. Anything that's smaller and quicker and might just make your life a bit easier is also good to know about. Anyway, here's my list of potential major developments. I think they're self-explanatory. If they're not, then pop a question in the Q&A, and I can expand a bit on them. They're approximately in priority order, or our best estimate of priority order. But if you think something is too low down and you want it to see it higher up, then again, let us know and give us that information in your feedback. Likewise, anything that's not in the list at all that you would like to see added to OrcaWave, tell us that in your feedback, and we'll add it to our full list of possible ideas. So obviously, I'm not promising that all of these are going to be implemented in the next release, and in practice, some of them may never get implemented, but we do sometimes implement the things you request, and we always listen and take note of the feedback you give us. So please do give us your feedback after the webinar on this, or indeed anything else. Okay, well, I'll leave that list up just so that you can peruse it and ponder it while I wrap up the webinar now. If you've got any remaining questions, pop them in the Q&A, and after I've said these last few remarks, we'll move on to a discussion of the open questions. As I mentioned just a minute ago, you'll get a feedback form via email after the webinar. So that's your main route for giving feedback, if you could. We've been recording this webinar, and it will be published on our website, as were the recordings of the session last week on OrcaFlex and the 11.1 user group meeting webinars back in March. So if you want to refer back to something, or you have a colleague who you want to refer to part of the webinar, you can look out for those recordings, and we'll get those on our website as soon as we can. So the last thing to say is thank you very much for attending and listening to me as I've been taking you through these things today. Thank you for your support, and I think we'll move into Q&A now. So just bear with me as I juggle my my windows here. So you go back to OrcaWave. So let me go to Q&A, and I think these are likely they look like they're in chronological order. So, but there's maybe about a dozen or so questions here. So I'll just rattle through them. First question, is there a possibility to add AutoCAD mesh file support, mesh format in the future? I mean, yes, that's possible if so.
Would you like me to chip in a bit on this one?
Yeah, why don't you?
Hello everyone. It tends to be me that picks up the mesh file format, and in principle we can support anything that we can robustly understand the format. So what tends to work well in the past is when users that want a particular format, they've given us some help and support in implementing it. So if you'd like AutoCAD mesh file format, then and you can supply us with the documentation, because we're not AutoCAD users. If you can supply some documentation, a bit of support and some examples, then that's something we definitely look at. And that applies to any mesh file format. I'll hand you back to Chris now.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, good. So next question then. Will the Morison model be used, also be used in the diffraction analysis, e.g. for excitation loads, or only in the radiation for radiation damping? Yeah, hopefully I answered that as I talked through the Morison elements feature. At the moment, they're only used for drag. So if you want to capture wave loads or radiation damping caused by struts or elements like that in your model, then you need to include those bits of the structure in the panel mesh. So yeah, at the moment, the Morison model is only used to capture drag, which would not otherwise be captured in the diffraction analysis. Which is yeah, as I say, they're very closely analogous to the Morison element objects that exist in OrcaFlex. Okay, I think that answers your question. On to the next one then. Can OrcaWave generate velocity RAO and acceleration RAO in this new version? If it still can't, is there a plan to upgrade to generate these RAOs? So I assume you mean velocity and acceleration of the body. No, they're not available. I suppose they can be computed from the displacement RAOs, I think, if I understand your question correctly, relatively simply. So that might be a question to pop into our software support, actually, because I think we could show you how to generate those from the displacement RAO results relatively simply. Or if not, you can tell us why I've misunderstood your question, but I think that is relatively simple post-processing task to do. Okay, on to the next question. Why is the number of components a parameter in the wave spectrum? Well, you can, so the reason for that, if I let me share my screen again. Oh, there it is. I've lost my oh no, it is sharing. Okay, fine. I lost my Zoom menu for a minute there. Yeah, so this question is about, in the wave spectrum data form, why is there a choice for wave components here? So this dictates how many components the spectrum is discretized into. So your frequency spectrum would be some continuous function of frequency, and then that curve is discretized into, in this case, 197 components of each of a given frequency and amplitude. Why is that option provided to you? Well, it's to give you some control over the coarseness, the fineness of the representation of the spectrum in the drag linearization. So what this means that you don't need to have a very, very fine list of a large number of wave periods in your diffraction calculation. So in this list of periods here, you don't need to have 197 periods here. You can have perhaps 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 as you would have in a normal diffraction analysis. But you can still you can have a finer representation of the spectrum in the drag linearization. And for wave periods that the wave components here will encounter, we do the treatment that you would get in OrcaFlex of interpolating the diffraction results between the periods that you've performed your calculation for. So this is really to give you some flexibility without on the representation of the spectrum, without having to necessarily perform your diffraction calculation with an enormous number of wave periods, which could be very time consuming. Okay, on to the next one then. For the drag linearization, is there a tool for estimating the error of the linearization for different wave conditions? Not that I'm aware of. I don't know if any of my colleagues want to correct me on that, but not that I'm aware of. I think the best you can do is try refining, well, either modifying the C state or refining the representation of the spectrum via the number of wave components and seeing if that affects the answer. And if you were to do that, then the way to do it would be with a restart analysis. That would allow you to do that really, much quicker. Okay.
Sorry, Chris. Can I just
go on. Yeah.
I mean, just in case that they're referring to the error between the linear and the non-linear case, then perhaps the tool there is OrcaFlex. If you run the model, if you import the diffraction data into OrcaFlex, and run the equivalent model in the nonlinear time domain, and then look at the results, perhaps then against the same in the frequency domain, you could even synthesize the loads and see a difference between the nonlinear and the linear case. If that's if that's the area that they're referring to there.
Yeah. Okay.
Synthesization error, in which case, what I think you said was obviously the right way to go.
Yeah. No, you're quite right. Thank you, James, for pitching in. Yeah. So James is quite right in what he said there. I can't really improve on that. Good. Okay. So next question: is there a timeline for forward speed implementation? No, not that I want to promise, I'm afraid. I have been looking at it in quite some detail recently, and looking at what possible approaches there are to take. If forward speed diffraction is something you're particularly keen on, then yeah, I would really appreciate any expression of what approach you want to see in OrcaWave, because it appears that the different software packages out there all take a slightly different approach to that problem. So if you want forward speed implementation because you want to recreate results you can get from software X, then tell me what it is you're trying to recreate. It would be good to know. Otherwise, we need to do a bit more work to decide what's the approach we should take in OrcaWave. It is bubbling up to the top of the list, so it is coming. But I'm not sure I want to promise it for the next release. I'm afraid. Okay, so on to the next question. If you're selecting center of mass for the inertia properties, is the same reference also used for the resulting hydrodynamic database? I see what you mean. So the question here is, if I specify my inertia data relative to the center of mass, would the results be presented relative to the center of mass? And the answer to that is no. This is just used for specifying the meaning of the matrix that you've provided in the input data. Now, as I said later on in the webinar, so maybe this question was answered, the results are still all presented by default at the body origin, as in previous versions, but there are now some tools that you can extract RAOs and added mass and damping at an origin of your choice. So if you need to get that information to compare against some other source or some report or something, then you can do that for the RAOs and the added mass and damping. But for the import into OrcaFlex and the subsequent use of your OrcaWave results, we haven't changed how the results are presented, and those origins are still handled by the import into OrcaFlex. Okay, on to the next question here. Is there a timeline for implementing sloshing features in OrcaWave, which I guess is what I referred to as tanks in my my list of future developments? No, again, not one that I want to commit myself to. We've had relatively few requests for sloshing and tanks compared to the other items. That's why they're lower down that list I showed you. So if it's something you want and you haven't told us that you want it, then please give us that feedback, and we will know how many people are waiting for that functionality. Okie dokie. Can we give some degree of freedom for the connection between bodies so that we can also define a stiffness and a damping connection? Yeah, that would be a new feature, but it's certainly possible. So instead of saying that one body is rigidly connected to another, could we say that there's a sort of spring-like connection between them, or even a damped spring? Yeah, I think that's perfectly possible as a future development. So if that's something you'd like, let us know in the feedback form, and it'll get into the list of options that we're prioritizing and picking from. So let me move on to the next question. How do I add the mooring stiffness matrix to a connected multi-body OrcaWave model? So a couple of ways to interpret that question. If you had a multi-body model, at present each body, so this is my 4-body model of the OC4 wind platform, each body can have its own stiffness, external stiffness and external damping matrix. So you can do that in the program as it is. If you want to model stiffness in the between two bodies, then that's it's kind of what the previous question was asking. You know, could you have a sort of spring-like connection between bodies? You can't represent that in OrcaWave at the moment, but it's something that we could add. So not quite. This is Daniel Tornroos's question. I'm not quite sure exactly which of those two things you're asking about, but if it's the latter, then tell us in your feedback form, and we'll make a note, because the sort of stiffness between two bodies in a sort of as if they were connected by a spring is something that you can't capture at the moment in OrcaWave, but we could add that in future. Okay, we're moving through the questions now. The next one: if Morison elements are modeled in OrcaWave and their effect is included in the RAOs, would you still model them the same way in an OrcaFlex study? So that is a very good question, actually, David, and probably something I should have said as I was going along. So the short answer is yes, you would model them in the same way in OrcaFlex. So their effect is only included in the displacement RAOs in your OrcaWave results. And then the things that depend on the displacement RAOs, which are the QTFs and the C-state RAOs, as I was saying, they're not, there's no effect of the Morison elements on load RAOs and added mass and damping. So if you're using this data in a following OrcaFlex study, then you should include the Morison elements in OrcaFlex, and that's why we now make it possible to import those from your OrcaWave model directly into OrcaFlex. And then if you want to capture the drag loads in OrcaFlex, yeah, that would be done via the Morison elements there. Yeah, okay. I think that answers the question. Move on to the next one. Would it be possible to have an option to generate only the diagonal or the sum frequency, only the diagonal of the sum frequency QTFs, or the difference? Well, we have the, you're able to, hang on, there's a second part to this question. So would it be possible to generate only the diagonal of the full sum frequency or difference frequency QTFs? That's the question. This is useful when working in monochromatic waves for some studies. I don't see a way to do this apart from doing batch runs, requiring a different model for each case. The answer to that question, I think, is partly yes and partly no. If you're doing a QTF solve, you have this range of QTF periods or frequencies. So you can restrict to the diagonal elements of the difference frequencies by restricting your range of QTF frequencies from 0 to 0. So I think that you can do it for the difference frequencies. For the sum frequencies, no, you can't. So you would have to, at the moment, you would have to do it if you just wanted the sum frequencies for on the diagonal. You would have to do a different calculation for each one. The best advice I can give you in the current program, if you're doing that, is to make use of the restarts functionality. So that would accelerate those QTF models quite a lot, because you wouldn't have to repeat the first order solve. You could just do that once, and then you could have a restart model for each sort of double frequency if you were looking sort of looping through the sum frequency QTFs for double frequencies. But yeah, I'm afraid that's what you would have to do. It sounds like that's what you're doing already. Okay, on to the next question from Sanday. You mentioned spring in between bodies in the development list. Does this mean you can't add a stiffness to the constraint matrix in between bodies? Yeah, indeed it does. Yeah, and I think I covered that in a previous question. So hopefully that's clear. And then final question in the list is a suggestion for the forward speed approach, which is the time domain ranking panel method. Yeah, which I'm aware of. So it's good to hear that. I believe that's the approach that Wasim takes in the DNV toolkit. Yeah, okay, it's good to know that. That's that's one of the things I've been looking at, but we're not clear yet what the best approach to take is. Time domain obviously would be a bit of a departure for OrcaWave, but if that's the best approach, then that might have to be what it is. Right. Okay. Well, that's the end of the questions in the Q&A. So I'm happy to wrap up now. I think we'll keep the webinar open for a little while in case anyone has any last questions they want to ask. Other than that, thank you for listening and attending, and goodbye. Happy Christmas.